A day of remembrance across America. Dan Rather at CBS News headquarters in New York. At this hour, the national prayer service has concluded at the National Cathedral in Washington. Next stop for President Bush, the scene of the World Trade Center disaster in Lower Manhattan. He is coming to New York and into the rain and into a still grieving city. Also at this hour, the Justice Department has released the names of the alleged hijackers, now numbering 19, the people in the plane. That's up from the first announced 18. For whatever reason, the Justice Department has not released, as it said it would, the pictures of the hijackers in the sky. President Bush has authorized the call-up of 50,000 National Guardsmen and reservists, recognizing that they will have to sacrifice more than some by giving up their home life, family life, their work, their jobs, to come in service of their country. The United States Senate has unanimously approved the use of force, and the Congress has approved $40 billion in emergency aid, while everybody recognizes that's probably just the beginning. What was called yesterday a down payment is for emergency aid and for money to pay for what the military will need extra. House action is expected on this very soon. New York City area airports reopened today after a dozen detained people have been cleared of suspicion. There's one person at last report still being detained, but most, if not all, of those detained yesterday have been released. In Lower Manhattan, rain is hampering the rescue effort, but the effort goes on. Almost 600 people are now confirmed dead at all locations. The number missing is about 5,000. Jim Stewart is in Washington. Jim?
Dan, I know the FBI today would like to be able to announce that it has arrested any accomplices in this attack, but at this hour that is not the case. As you pointed out, they have released the names now of 19 hijackers, not 18. An additional name was added to those who allegedly, or not allegedly, we know now for a fact, hijacked the aircraft out of Dulles and crashed it into the Pentagon. They are not going to release the photographs, quite frankly, because they're not sure they're marrying up all the right pictures with the names. And frankly, too, they say they have some leads that are taking them in directions that they don't want people who may recognize these photographs to understand that the FBI knows who exactly that they are. We can tell you this much about the 19 names, and quite frankly, it's just astounding, because it is clear from reading the information that's been released today by the FBI about these hijackers that these were, for lack of another word, Dan, sleeper agents who had been in this country, some of them, for years. We have 3 of these people who had residences in California at one time or another, including Los Angeles and San Diego. We have 12 who lived in the United States, including half a dozen in Delray Beach, Florida. In Florida, who lived in Delray Beach for some time. Others lived in Daytona, Hollywood, Florida, and Coral Springs, Florida. We had one who lived in Fort Lee, New Jersey, another who lived in Phoenix, Arizona. Several of these suspects had the same last name, but that does not mean necessarily that they were brothers, but may have obviously come from the extended family. The word in Arabic for brother and cousin is the same, so that doesn't necessarily mean they were closely related. In other news, the intelligence officials continue to say today, and this is quite critical to future planning in terms of retaliation, there is no sign thus far of any state-sponsored terrorism in these acts. All the signs continue to point to the name we've heard so often, Osama bin Laden. Dan?
Jim Stewart. Jim, we have the names and we're prepared to put them up on the screen and may do that as the afternoon goes along. But you said something we think is worth noting, and that is that some of these names may not be, they may be aliases. They may not be the names of, if you will, real people. But for whatever, if anything, they may be worth, these are the names connected with the airline planes on which they were, these people. Now, if you're saying, well, we thought we were going to have the pictures of these people. Yes, the Attorney General and the Director of the FBI indicated yesterday that we would have the photographs of them last night. The photographs have not been released, and we want to underscore what Jim Stewart said. Apparently, they have been released because certainly the Justice Department would want the proper names attached to the proper photographs, being apparently uncertain that they could absolutely, with full confidence, do that. They've elected now not to release the photographs. And as suspected, but now confirmed, a large number of these people were living in the United States and had indeed been trained as pilots, or at the very least received some kind of advanced training as pilots in this country. We'll be covering more about that as time goes along, but right now let's go to Bob Orr in our Washington Bureau to bring us up to date on two things: the state of airline travel in this country and the state of the black boxes, one of which has been recovered. In fact, more than one has now been recovered, right, Bob?
That's right, Dan. Let's start with the black boxes. 3 were recovered, 2 from the Pentagon crash site and 1 from the Pennsylvania crash site. And I have to tell you, there is bad news for investigators about the Pentagon box that they were most interested in. The cockpit voice recorder from American Airlines Flight 77
Who's this?
apparently does not have anything useful in terms of this investigation. I talked to some sources this morning who told me that the box was so badly damaged by the fire and by the impact that they literally, in the lab at the NTSB, couldn't even get it open to attempt to retrieve the data. The fear is, even if it eventually is open, even if they can reconstruct somehow the tape that's been shattered, that they will have very, very little, if anything, to go on. This is a big blow to the investigation, in the sense that investigators were trying to find out more about what was going on in the cockpits. What did the terrorists talk about? Were there communications from the pilots? Just kind of the mindset as that plane closed in on the Pentagon. Now, the other black box from the Pentagon does have data. That's the flight data recorder. It's not of much interest to the investigation because we already know what happened with the airplane. It could clear up that one question about whether or not the plane circled through Washington and seemingly selected a target, and that could be cleared up at some point when they read it. Finally, about the Pennsylvania crash, also one box there has been recovered, the flight data recorder. That will be read out later, I'm told. But missing in that is the cockpit voice recorder. It may be the only remaining chance that investigators have to find out firsthand from tape recordings what was going on in the air as this attack unfolded on Tuesday. And Dan, just very quickly about airlines. The system, again, is staggering to get back to some semblance of normalcy. But this morning across America, we saw huge lines, crushing delays. And at this hour, some airports, including Boston's Logan and Washington's Reagan National, remain closed and may be closed for some time. Dan?
Bob Orr. We go to the Pentagon and David Martin. David?
Dan, the Defense Department and FBI are investigating the possibility that 2 of those hijackers may actually have attended U.S. military schools. 2 of the names on that list are the same as the names of 2 men from Middle Eastern Air Forces who attended the Defense Language Institute at Lackland Air Force Base in Texas and the Air War College at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. Now, at neither of those schools would they have learned how to fly. All they would have gotten was basic proficiency in English and exposure to basic Air Force doctrine. But it certainly would be a cruel irony if it were confirmed, and I must stress it is not confirmed. The names are the same, but it is not confirmed. If, in fact, 2 of these hijackers learned English at U.S. Air Force schools. One other thing, Dan, I think we know a lot more now about what the U.S. is planning, because if you look at the complete list of what the U.S. has requested of Pakistan, you can see that this is a major operation in the works for going after Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan. They have not asked not just for overflight rights. They've asked for landing rights. They've asked for access to air bases. They've asked for access to naval ports and the ability to station military intelligence personnel in Pakistan. So if in fact, this operation goes forward, and if, in fact, the Pakistanis approve those requests, which they have not yet, Pakistan would be a major staging ground for what promises to be some major strikes into Afghanistan. Dan?
David, very quickly, I want to make sure I understand, and quite rightly you said, look, we don't have this totally nailed down, we don't have 3 sources on it yet, but there are indications that at least 2 of the hijackers in the planes, in addition to having been trained to fly in this country perhaps, were trained by the U.S. military?
That's right, but what we have to make clear is that what is for sure is that the names are the same. The names of the hijackers match the names of 2 people who attended these 2 schools. But what has not yet been run to ground is whether, in fact, those people with the same names are, in fact, the same individuals.
Understand, and we wanted complete clarity on that. And just a cautionary note, we've learned over the last few days, been reminded of one of the sort of rules of journalism. Beware early information, because what you hear first, what may appear to be true, later frequently turns out to be untrue. But this is certainly an interesting development to pursue, the possibility that 2 of the hijackers are actually trained by the U.S. military, at least in language skills. Now, no one, so far as I know, in officialdom has said so publicly, but it's clear that some of the hijackers had as their country of national origin Egypt, and some had Saudi Arabia. Perhaps I should say it appears that way. That isn't to say that countries of national origin or some of the others were not other countries, but the line is leading back to Egypt and back to Saudi Arabia in terms of identifying these men, these killers, as to from where did they come to the United States. Ed Bradley?
Well, Dan, here's an interesting difference, if in fact this is true about Lackland Air Force Base. Another indication of the difference between these terrorists and the ones who were implicated in the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center. In that case, those men worked in secret cells and, in a sense, lived underground. The terrorists this time made no attempt to hide. They hid in the open. In fact, they seemed to go out of their way, although some said they kept to themselves, to live openly in the communities in which they were residing, in Florida and Arizona, and in some cases New Jersey. They weren't trying to live underground. They were trying to go unnoticed by being open in their communities.
Ed Bradley, let's go to John Roberts at the White House. John?
Dan, Marine One just landed here at the White House. You may be able to hear it spooling down behind me. The president is headed off to New York this afternoon to get a first-hand look at the damage there. He'll tour the scene, talk with some of the rescue workers on hand. It's likely that he may also visit a hospital and then meet with New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani and the governor of New York State, George Pataki. Although I have to tell you, Dan, they're really keeping his schedule under wraps, which is uncharacteristic for the White House, but of course not unusual in a circumstance like this. The security cordon around the White House itself has now been extended out 12 blocks. And during the ceremony at the National Cathedral, Dan, we heard jet fighters flying combat air patrol over the Washington, D.C. area. That's one of the reasons why the president authorized a partial call-up of reserves, 13,000 of which will be coming from the U.S. Air Force. That's to fly combat air patrol in the corridor between Washington, D.C. and New York City. And, Dan, that looks like it's a process that's going to go on indefinitely. And part of the reason why the president went to Congress to ask for a $20 billion appropriation in emergency funds. Congress offered to double that, and in fact has approved that in the Senate and is likely to do so in the House. The voting was suspended because of a problem with the machine. They then had to go off to the National Cathedral, but they'll get right back to it just as soon as they get back to the Capitol building. From the president today at the National Cathedral, some words of comfort for a nation in what the president termed our middle hour of grief, and also words of warning. Not just for the terrorists involved here, Dan, but also for the nation to say this is a long process, and this is one that is going to be not only the focus of his administration, but one that could take this country on a war footing for a number of years. The president saying the responsibility to history is already clear to answer these attacks and rid the world of their evil. We are a peaceful nation, but fierce when stirred to anger. Yesterday, we had about a 45-minute briefing with a senior administration official familiar with all of the machinations and combinations and permutations of what's going on and what could possibly happen. That administration official said to us, Dan, that it's probably good to think about this in terms of years. Back to you.
John, a couple of questions. First, since this is America's new war, what President Bush called the first world war of the 21st century, the war against terrorism, has there been any talk at the White House of asking for sacrifice for all Americans? One of the lessons we thought we learned out of the Vietnam War, and which we put into effect in the Gulf War, if we're going to war, you go all in. There's no such thing as, halfway or a quarter of the way. And when President Roosevelt spoke to the nation after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, he made it clear that the war effort was going to require sacrifice from every American. It wasn't just, well, our military is going to wage it. Has there been any talk or any sense of that around the White House? I haven't felt it, I haven't heard it myself, but you're there.
Well, I was just about to say, Dan, that we haven't heard that direct language yet, but certainly they seem to be laying the foundation for that. The administration official that we had a briefing with yesterday said this is not going to be a single-pronged, one-time attack. This is going to be multi-pronged. It is going to be a multi-level attack. And again, the sustained nature of this. So, Dan, at the very least, they are laying the groundwork to the American people to say this is going to take our country down a long road, and it's a road that is going to absolutely consume this administration and this nation. This idea of everyone may have to be prepared to sacrifice may be the next step along that road. You're looking at Air Force One here spooling up now on the south lawn of the White House, the Washington Monument in the background. Sorry, Marine One. I said Air Force One, my mistake. Air Force One, of course, is a U.S. Air Force plane. This is a Marine helicopter. The president will be leaving most likely for Andrews Air Force Base, where he will take off for New York. Typically, the president would land at Kennedy Airport and then go into the Wall Street heliport via helicopter. We're told that he's not going to be landing at JFK. He's going to be going to an undisclosed location and then making his way into New York from there. In fact, Dan, we are hearing now that the noise of the helicopter there. The White House has been fairly open for the last few days about the specific locations of its officials. It will no longer do so. There has been reams and reams of intelligence information coming in from around the globe. I'm sure you can imagine that no intelligence agency wants to be accused of hanging on to something that could be pertinent to this investigation or pertinent to any current threat, either against the president or other sections of the government. So there's all of this coming in, crossing investigators' desks, Dan, and the real word here is take all necessary precautions, because there is a sense that perhaps this isn't over just yet.
Well, and that's worth reminding ourselves that Vice President Dick Cheney, so far as can be determined, he's still at Camp David in Maryland, is he not, John?
Well, Dan, at this point, they're not saying. They told us yesterday afternoon that he went from spending nights at Camp David and working here at the White House during the day to staying at Camp David until the weekend. The only thing we know about the Vice President's whereabouts, Dan, is where he was not, and that is that he was not at the National Cathedral for that National Prayer Service.
Ed Bradley?
Well, the question you asked John about what the vocabulary they're using and what President Roosevelt said, the term they're using at the Pentagon is Homeland Defense, in calling up military reservists
Did I really
who
say
are
Air
being
Force
called
One?
up to provide port operations, medical support, engineer support, generic civic support, and Homeland Defense, which is a term that harkens back to the Second World War.
Let's go to downtown Manhattan, watching the recovery operation. CBS News correspondent John Frankel. John, the weather turned bad today with heavy rain. As we think about the president now on his trip to New York City, the question is, how has the rain affected the rescue and recovery operations?
Well, Dan, it has really hampered the operations, although except for stopping briefly at noon for a moment of silence, the search and rescue teams, the firefighters, and the other workers who have volunteered here have continued to go on. We want to show you some tape from earlier this morning that shows them keeping at it. They are going bit by bit, piece by piece, to take out the debris. They are using big machines, little hands. They have lined up in columns. They use little shovels. They take off pieces of debris. They sift through it. They put it in buckets. That's loaded on the dump trucks that we've heard about and are moved out. The rain certainly hampered those efforts today. Lightning did as well through the course of the evening. It has stopped raining right now, although it is expected to continue to be a light drizzle through most of the afternoon. But the footing is slippery, lots of mud, and that is making it difficult at ground zero. It is a daunting task when you see it up close, and quite frankly, a very tedious process. But as we said, lots and lots of firefighters and rescue workers as they change shifts constantly through the day, continuing to get to ground zero and changing out and continuing on in this process. As people at memorial services around the country sing of pride and glory, these search and rescue teams continue to work in concert, hoping for signs of life. But I can tell you that just a few minutes ago, we did see a truck drive by. Posted on the side, it said Bellevue Morgue. Dan?
John Frankel, as the nation's airline system and air transport system as a whole struggles to get back to some sense of normalcy, look, it's never going to be what it was before, but at least some level of normalcy. Let's check in with Mark Strassman at Atlanta's Hartsfield Airport. Mark?
Dan, that sense of normalcy, of course, is what everyone wants, especially the flying public. And from talking to a number of folks inside the terminal here today, I can tell you that there is a good deal of anxiety. The fear factor of flying again, to be sure. But the real worry today is more practical. It's simply finding a plane that will actually lift off. Only about 40% of scheduled flights here in Atlanta are taking off today, and they are taking off from a very changed airport. The relative serenity that you see behind me ends the moment you step in the terminal.
A ticket with today's date. I need a ticket with today's date.
Atlanta's air travelers today have a date with Bedlam.
Where you going?
To Orlando.
Destination somewhere up ahead, the ticket counter, with a detour to confusion.
Right around to the right, young lady.
And delay.
We've been in line now about an hour, and we've still got a long way to go. So
A long way to go.
a long way to go.
Lines were hundreds deep. With curbside check-in gone, the bottleneck predictably was at the ticket counters.
Our flight is leaving at 10:20, and we thought we'd come in early at 7 o'clock, and it was not too early. Just barely going to make it, I think.
As they stood and read the latest on what explains all this, many of the frustrated said they know air travel has to change, but not into this.
But we got to figure out something better than this. This is not going to work.
The system's not working. It really isn't. It's just, I mean, I know they have to do something, but they have to figure something else out.
Like the people in this shoulder-to-shoulder terminal, this is a system struggling to find its way again.
So about twice as many airplanes taking off today than took off yesterday. The fact that New York City's 3 major airports are back open again, that of course will help here, although those airports are flying only on a very limited schedule. By this weekend, Atlanta's airport, the world's busiest airport, hopes to be flying at about 70% capacity. And by then, perhaps, some of the folks in this terminal today may actually have the chance to get wherever it is they want to go. Dan?
Mark Strassman in Atlanta. In Los Angeles, at the Los Angeles International Airport, is CBS's Sandra Hughes. Sandra?
Dan, all but a handful of the nation's airports have reopened today. Less than 30 of the nation's 451 airports are closed. Now, planes started crisscrossing the country this morning as the air traffic system just sort of tried to inch its way back to some normalcy and try to catch up to the regular schedule. Here in Los Angeles, as Mark was saying, it's just same as it was down in Atlanta. Lines are snaking outside of the terminals as people line up trying to catch canceled flights, trying to catch flights that were scheduled today, get to where they're going. But you know what I noticed the most here in Los Angeles as I walked up and down talking to the folks in those lines is just this amazing sense of patience, of courtesy, of understanding of these air travelers. I didn't find one person who in any way was outraged at the fact that they had to stand in line or angry that security was going to take them a little bit more. Now maybe that's people here in Los Angeles, I'm not sure, but I was just really struck by this amazing sense of patience and understanding. I spoke with quite a few people who are trying to get flights back to the East Coast. to reunite with friends and family who have been directly affected by this horrible tragedy. Some are holding flags, some have flags on their lapels. Excuse me, it's a little bit touching. I'm sorry about that. You know, I also noticed a scene where some pilots and some flight attendants were walking through the terminal, and the line just parted, just sort of as an honor. They let them walk through. So just an amazing sense of understanding and patience here at this airport, even though the lines are just outrageous. At one point this morning, 1,700 flights were flying through America's airspace. Now, that is about half of the usual number of flights for a weekday morning. Dan, back to you.
Sandra Hughes, and what a strong point, Sandra. Anybody who comes to America and doesn't remark on the courtesy and kindness of the American people as a whole has missed something essential about this country. And we know that about ourselves. And at places such as these crowded and frustrating airports, it's a good chance to demonstrate anew that a very important part of our national personality is courtesy and kindness, not just to strangers, but also to one another. The situation is pretty much the same at airports all around the country, Atlanta, Los Angeles. Yes, there are differences, but overall the pattern sort of fits. It's an effort to struggle back to sort of get the system working again. That's true in Chicago as well. We're going to go to Cynthia Bowers in Chicago, but not about the air travel there. Cynthia's in downtown Chicago, and she's just attended a ceremony consistent with this National Day of Prayer and Remembrance. Cynthia, tell us about it.
Dan, it's been a very emotional hour here down in downtown Chicago. Tens of thousands of people of different races, creeds, cultures, and ages, many of them carrying and waving American flags, gathered here at Daley Plaza to remember the victims, their families, and their friends. Then at 11:59, there was a moment of silence. It was marked by a tolling bell. The silence was observed by everyone here, by people in their office buildings, those in restaurants, those in factories, and even the students at Chicago Public Schools stood silently by their desks for a minute. All radio stations went quiet. Mayor Daley said that there's a need for people to come together in large groups to find comfort. For those of us who have only been an audience to the terrible tragedy that's been experienced firsthand on the East Coast, there's been a real sense of frustration. People are still trying to find comfort and figure out how to help. That's why so many are waving flags, flying flags at their homes, donating blood and sending money. They want to do something tangible to show that they care. And if I may share these words with you, Francis Cardinal George, the Catholic Archbishop of Chicago, says the full extent of the human loss is finally beginning to reach us, and it's going to be days, weeks, and perhaps even years before we fully grasp the tremendous loss that we have suffered as a people and a nation. I think that those words are appreciated by everybody here and perhaps everybody in America. And Dan, there's been a young man behind me holding a sign that shows the Twin Towers that says America shall prevail. I think the question that we're all grappling with is how best to do that. Dan?
Cynthia Bowers in Chicago. Make no mistake, the United States of America is still on alert. President Bush is activating up to 50,000 reservists and National Guardsmen for what is being called Homeland Guard, to guard the homeland. That, of course, would free up regular members of the military to do whatever it is the president finally decides is necessary to do. David Martin says that the plan, among other things, is, if Pakistan will allow it, to establish a presence in the ports of Pakistan, on some of the airfields there, to put an intelligence presence in Pakistan. Those sort of things are in the works. They require manpower, and as manpower is shifted to those kinds of operations, should they be effective, then you need others to fill in behind them here in the United States, and that's why the reservists and the National Guards people are being called up. At the same time, the grim and gritty work of rescue and recovery continues in the rain here in New York City. You're watching CBS News continuing coverage of attack on America on this day, National Day of Prayer and Remembrance.